Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How to Amplify Your Leadership Development Strategy. My name is Caitlin and I'm a marketing manager at the Myers-Briggs company. This webinar will be around an hour and it is being recorded, which we will be sending out the recording and a copy of the slides in the next few days. Now I'm happy to introduce our speaker. John Hackston will be our presenter. He is a chartered psychologist and is head of thought leadership for the Myers-Briggs company. His role is central to keeping our assessments relevant to the changing world of work. Today, he will be drawing on his research and his knowledge of the Firo model of interpersonal behavior to show how important these areas are for leadership development. So I will hand it over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And yes, today I'm going to be looking at how helping leaders to understand their interpersonal needs, their interpersonal behavior is really absolutely essential to their development, and also, of course, to the well-being of the people who report to them. And I'm guessing you all heard of lots of talk about the turnover tsunami or the great resignation, whatever other names are going around, where many people who were really just holding on to their jobs during COVID started to look for new roles, new jobs. Other people decided that they wanted to do something else with their lives once the pandemic started to die down. And in most territories, in most countries, there's still quite low unemployment, and many jobs, especially in some sectors, are really quite difficult to fill. So it's really important that you hold on to your best employees, especially as it's the ones with the greatest skill set, the ones who you really want to keep, but are realistically going to be the most attractive to other employers. Now, there are obviously many ways to hang on to those workers: better pay, better conditions, more interesting and engaging work, although there may be limits to what you can do for different reasons to each of these. But there's also one piece of, I guess, folk wisdom, one well-worn phrase that I think is worthwhile paying a lot of attention to in this context. People don't quit jobs, they quit managers. And it isn't just something that people say. There's a lot of evidence behind this. To quote an academic article in the Journal of Leadership and Organizational Studies just a few years ago, the current research provides support for the prevailing folk wisdom that employees leave managers. And we found very much the same thing in some research we carried out ourselves earlier this year. We asked people how much they agreed or disagreed with the statement that you can see at the bottom of that chart: I'm looking for a new job. We also asked them to answer 8 questions relating to how supportive they felt their manager was, and added up their answers to produce an overall manager support scale, an overall scale of how supportive their manager was. And when we compared those two scores with Firo and the manager support scale, this is what we found. Perhaps not surprisingly, the more supportive people felt their manager was, the less likely they were, the less likely the employee was to be looking for a new job. Another research, other large-scale surveys are coming up with very similar results. The data you can see on your screen at the moment is from a survey of 2,000 people looking at what people said when they were asked why they were looking for a new job. They could choose more than one option, which is why obviously those percentages add up to more than 100%. And you can see on the chart there that the top 3 were first of all a toxic company culture, then low salary, and then poor management. So poor management was a direct cause of people leaving their job, as well as likely contributing quite a lot to that idea of a toxic company culture. And in a very large study in 2021, MIT researchers combed through 1.4 million, that's 1.4 million Glassdoor reviews. And again, the biggest contribution to workplace attrition was a toxic company culture. And although people will often say low salary is important. These researchers found that toxic culture was 10 times more important than salary in motivating people to leave their role. And when they looked at that toxic culture in more detail, these 5 factors stood out. Toxic cultures, first of all, were non-inclusive. Now, we've talked about inclusion in previous webinars, and it covers those sorts of areas, but also more generally, inequities and perceived inequities in terms of gender, race, sexual orientation and identity, age and disability, and the effects of cronyism and nepotism. These cultures were more disrespectful. There's a lot of consideration, a lack of courtesy, out of affording other people dignity. They included many unethical behaviours, dishonesty, not complying with regulations and laws even. They were more cutthroat. People will stab others in the back, metaphorically, not literally. There was ruthless competition, and they were abusive. There was bullying, there was harassment, and there was overt hostility. And if you think about what you can see there, a great deal of what you see in those last 4 areas may be to do with people's interpersonal style, their interpersonal behaviours, and especially the interpersonal behaviours of leaders and of managers, people with the power, people with the clout in an organisation. So having a tool and a framework to understand interpersonal behaviour is likely to be especially important for leaders, and might well be a key component of any leadership development strategy. And the framework that I'm going to talk about today is called the Firo, and in particular the Firo B. And Firo B stands for Fundamental Interpersonal Relations Orientation Behaviour. It asks you questions about your behaviour, what you do. It can give you clues about your interpersonal needs, your interpersonal motivations, what you need, what you want, and what you show in your relations with other people. And for leaders, their relationships with their direct reports, their peers, and others in the organisation are really very central to how they work and to their development. Now, I know some of you may well have attended our last webinar, all of which also featured a Firo, but I know some of you didn't. So let's find out how much you all know already about the Firo model. So Caitlin, if you'd like to launch that first poll, please, all about your knowledge of the Firo. So you have a number of different options there. Perhaps you're a Firo practitioner, use it often. You're a Firo practitioner, but perhaps you need a refresher. You've received Firo feedback, but you're not trained to use it. You've heard of a Firo, but not completed it yourself. Or perhaps some of you are saying, what's the Firo? So let's just give you a chance to fill in those answers. And that'll give me a chance to have a little glass of water while you're putting your answers in there. So nearly 3/4 of you have voted. Let's give you just a little bit longer. So that's 3/4 of you. So Caitlin, I think we'll draw to a halt there. Oh, a few more. Caitlin, let's draw to a halt there. And then if you'd like to share those answers, please. So 5% of you are Firo practitioners, 3% of you are Firo practitioners but don't use it often. Some of you receive Firo feedback. 23%, nearly a quarter, have heard of a Firo, but 65% of you, nearly 2/3, are saying, what's a Firo? So if you'd like to stop sharing those results now, please, Caitlin, thank you. So as almost 2/3 of you don't really know a lot about a Firo, I'm just going to talk a little bit more before we look at the details of how it can help leaders, a little bit more about what the Firo is all about. So those of you who know a little bit about the Firo already, or who attended the last webinar, please let me beg your forgiveness while I just say a little bit about what the Firo is about. So let's try to bring a Firo to life a little bit. What I'd like you to do now is look through the words you can see on the screen and select maybe 2 or 3 if you can, that resonate with you, that particularly appeal to you. maybe write those words down, because we'll come back to them in just a short while. And for anybody who took part in the other Firo webinar that I ran just a few weeks ago, these aren't all the same words as you saw last time. It's a different selection, so please do take part in this exercise as well. And once you've chosen, perhaps, think about why you chose those words. What it is about those words that resonate with you. Let me just give you a moment to do that. And a chance to think about the 3 words that perhaps appeal most to you. And once you've done that, yes, please do write those down, and we'll come back to those words in just a short while. And each of those words relates to the areas covered by the Firo. And the Firo looks at our interpersonal behavior, and specifically our interpersonal needs in 3 areas. First of all, it looks at inclusion. And inclusion is the need to belong. It's about groups. How high, how great is your need to belong to a group? How much do you want to be included in groups? And how much do you want to include others in your group? Then control is all about influence. To have and to give clear direction and structure. And whereas inclusion is all about groups, control can apply both to one-to-one relationships, but also to groups as well. And affection is the need for intimacy. It's very much about one-to-one relationships. How much you want to have close personal relationships with other people, with other individuals. So those are the 3 areas that the Firo instrument covers. So let's go back to those words. And each of these has a link with one of those 3 areas. And you may have chosen a word from each need area, or all 3 words you've chose might be from just one area. And in that case, maybe that area is especially important to you. Maybe that's the main driver, the core driver of your interpersonal behavior. So these are the words that relate to inclusion, the need to belong. So just glance at those words now. Perhaps make a note of any of those words that you chose as your 3 words. And these are the words that relate to control, the need for influence. So again, have a look for those words. They're always in the same order on the screen. I haven't mixed things up. Did you choose any of those words when you were thinking about the words that resonated with you most? If you did, that word or those words relate to control. And finally, these are the words that relate to affection, the need for intimacy. So again, look through those and see if any of those words were the ones that you chose. So let's think about which need area, if any, jumped out for you. Was it the case that you chose words for one particular need area, for example? So, Caitlin, if you'd like to launch that next poll, please. So based on what you heard, based on the words that you've chosen, what is your clearest need area? Do those words that you chose relate principally to inclusion, or to affection, or to control, to more than one of those, or perhaps you're still not quite sure? So let me just give you a moment to answer that poll. Again, we'll see if we can get to a point where 3/4 of you have answered. Let me see, perhaps just a few more of you to vote. So I think we're up to 71% of you. Let's see if we can move it to 3/4. 72% is creeping up. Oh, and we're up to 76%. So Caitlin, if you'd like to draw that poll to a close, please, and share those results. So we can see that 1/3 of you 34% say more than one of these, then 30% control, 18% inclusion, 7% affection, and 11% I'm not sure. Okay, thanks, Caitlin. If you'd like to take those results away. Now, you know, some of you weren't sure, but of course, just picking words like this isn't going to be the most reliable way, the most consistent way of finding out your interpersonal needs. And that's why, of course, in practice, we use the Firo assessment, the psychometric questionnaire. And that lets us look at these interpersonal needs and behaviors in a lot more detail. Because for each of these areas, the Firo B questionnaire asks two different things. First of all, it asks people how much of that need is expressed to other people. How much of that behavior we initiate to others. So for inclusion, for example, how much do we try to include other people in our activities? What we've called expressed inclusion. And it also looks at how much we want from others. So for inclusion, how much do we need other people to include us in their group and involve us in their activities? What we've called wanted inclusion. For control, the extent to which we try to influence the control of others, wanted control, express control, and also wanted control. How much we want to be in an environment that provides us with structure and with clarity. Express control and wanted control. And for affection, express affection, how much we try to be warm and friendly with other people. Wanted affection, how much we want others to be warm and friendly to us. Expressed and wanted affection. So that gives 6 basic Firo scores: expressed and wanted inclusion, expressed and wanted control, expressed and wanted affection. And we can have a high, a medium, or a low score for each of these 6 areas. You can have a high, medium, or low level of need for each of those areas. So, for example, here are some of the behaviors you might expect to see in someone who's a high score on expressed inclusion. They're likely to want to include lots of people in activities and to do this very often. They may introduce people and take the initiative to find out about other people rather than waiting to be introduced. They're likely to enjoy talking and joking with people. They're likely to opt for more group and team approaches to tasks, and generally speaking, try to work with other people rather than working alone. In contrast, here are some of the behaviors you might see in someone who has a low score on expressed inclusion. There are not many people they seek to include, and they might not try to involve even those very often. They're likely to opt to work on projects on their own. Quite often they're going to prefer written rather than face-to-face communication. They'll tend to keep a relatively low profile, both at work and socially. And they'll try to control and, to some extent at least, keep to a minimum the amount of contact they have with other people. And you can see in these 2 pictures, for high express inclusion, we have a band leader who's wanting to include everybody in their band. They're giving hats to everybody to join in. For low express inclusion, they're just choosing one person to include in their band. And if someone has a medium score, a mid-range score, their behavior might be a mixture. They might be very selective about when they involve people, not involve people very often, but then when they do, include quite a number of people. Alternatively, there might be only a few people who they involve, but they include that select group of people, that special group of people quite often. Or quite often their behavior might very much depend on the situation. So those are the 6 basic Firo scores. But we can also look at someone's overall score on inclusion, on control, on affection. Which of these is the largest? And just like when you chose those words before, many people very clearly have one need area greater than the others. That is their core driver. The interpersonal need that's going to be the most important to them, the need they're less willing to give up, the need that's most important to them to get met, likely both at work and at home. And we can also look at the total express score and the total wanted score. Overall, how much behavior do they express to others? How much do they want from other people? Now, if these are similar, if a person's expressed behavior, what you see, if that matches their wanted behavior, what they want in return, other people usually know how much interpersonal interaction they need. But if they express is greater than the wanted, then that person might be giving other people the impression they actually want more from the people than they actually do, because people see the expressed behavior, they assume people want the same amount. And that person might then feel overwhelmed or pestered or smothered by the attention they get from other people. And if wanted is greater than expressed, then they might be giving other people what they want from them greater than they actually do. The interpersonal needs might not be met. And finally, we could also look at the overall score, the person's overall level of interpersonal needs. Now, so far, this is a little bit abstract perhaps, a little bit theoretical. Let's look at what this might mean for a real person, a real manager, a real leader. Here's Christine. And you can see that she has high expressed inclusion and medium wanted inclusion. She herself wants to involve lots of people, but when it comes to being included by others, she might pick and choose what activities she gets involved in. As a manager, as a leader, she's likely to involve hosting her own events, networking, gaining recognition and attention, but she appreciates at least some time working independently on her own projects. She doesn't want to be included by other people all of the time. She has high express control and medium wanted control. She wants to influence, to manage, to organize other people, but she's rather more ambivalent about others organizing her, or about having to follow specific instructions. She's likely to be happy to share some responsibilities with her subordinates, but she does want to remain in control, and she may sometimes micromanage them or have trouble delegating tasks. And she has medium expressed affection and low wanted affection. She'll generally have friendly but more business-like relationships with colleagues and subordinates, maybe some of them more than others, but they may see her as quite private and not always easy to get to know. She's likely to be uncomfortable when people share too much personal information with her. She may not find it easy if her reports come to her with personal information or personal problems. Now, control is her highest overall need area. She'll generally go to like a structured environment where there are clear lines of responsibility and authority so she can get things done. And overall, she has high expressed and medium wanted behaviors. She usually initiates activities of others rather than preferring them to take the initiative. And as a leader, obviously it's going to be important for Christine to be aware of how she's perceived by her team members. And if the behaviors don't match a team member's interpersonal needs, there can be misunderstandings, miscommunication, maybe leading ultimately to that sort of disengagement and perception of a lack of managerial support that we've seen contributes to people wanting to leave their job. So let's see how this works with Mike, who's one of Christine's team. Now, if we look at inclusion, they're likely to work well together. Christine has high expressed inclusion, Mike has high wanted inclusion. Christine wants to include Mike and other subordinates, and Mike wants to be included. Christine has a medium level of wanted inclusion, which generally works well for Mike, who doesn't try to include her all the time. On control, however, there might be a little bit more of a mismatch. There may be some issues there. With his low wanted control, Mike might not respond well to Christine's high express control, to her quite direct style, and may want a greater degree of autonomy than Christine might naturally think to give. Of course, if Christine is aware of this, she could modify their behavior, or maybe work out a modus operandi with Mike, agree which tasks can be delegated, which tasks perhaps shouldn't be delegated. On affection, they may be a little bit more complementary to each other. Christine has medium expressed affection, Mike high wanted affection. Christine may be able to go at least some way to meeting Mike's needs in this area. And that's probably important because affection is the core driver for Mike. But there's perhaps one catch here. With his overall low expressed and high wanted scores, Mike's needs might not be obvious. And in particular, Mike's wanted affection is obviously higher than his expressed affection. But if Christine is aware of her own style and of Mike's, things will be clearer, maybe made for a more harmonious relationship. Now, we've just looked at one example relationship there, and obviously a leader with a different Firo profile will face different challenges, and different challenges depending on who their reports, who their peers, who their own manager is. To help with this, we developed the Firo Business Leadership Report, which covers the areas that you can see on your screen at the moment. It looks at how a leader is likely to relate to their co-workers, how they relate to their manager, and also to their own direct reports. In addition, how they like to handle negotiations and how they might deal with conflict, how they typically make decisions and set targets, and perhaps some next steps they could take to continue their development. And I think we're going to send you a sample of this report following this webinar, and you can look through that at your leisure. Now, one thing you will notice when you get this report is that the wording is a little different, because this report uses a slightly different version of the Firo, pardon me, called Firo Business. Firo Business is very, very, very similar to Firo B. It still has the same 3 need areas. It still has expressed and wanted behaviors for each of those. The main difference is the language we used. Because what we found was, in a business context, and with senior leaders in particular, those names of inclusion, of control, and I'm afraid especially affection, don't always land well. Once people have Firo feedback and talk through and realize what their scales are about, they're absolutely fine, but initially there's some resistance. So to make things easier, especially in that leadership report, we've changed the names. Inclusion has become involvement, control has become influence, affection has become connection. But the names have been changed, but the scales are the same. So this is what we've talked about so far. We've looked at the importance of a leader's impersonal behavior in retaining employees. We look at those factors that can lead to employees leaving their roles, and we've seen how interpersonal behavior is relevant for those. We've taken a bit of a deeper dive into how we might look at interpersonal behavior and interpersonal needs using the Firo framework, and looked at some Firo profiles to give some examples of how that might work. And we've mentioned the Firo Business Leadership Report, which is obviously particularly useful in that leadership context. But as the second part of today's webinar, I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the research that links Firo to leadership, and let us think about how that might be useful to us and how we might use the Firo in the future. And I'm going to kick off by looking at this particular paper, and I think we're going to send you a copy of this again after the webinar. This is a study that isn't run by the Myers-Briggs company, it's an academic study. It actually goes back to 2010, but I think it's really worthwhile drawing your attention to because there's some very interesting findings in there. In this particular piece of research, the researchers asked 547 leaders and managers, first of all, to state what level they'd reached in their particular organizations. And they also asked those people to complete the Firo B and actually a range of other assessments as well. And the people were also independently rated on their leadership capability. And the first finding about research was that all 3 expressed need areas correlated positively with leadership ratings. People high on express inclusion, on express control, pardon me, and or express affection were rated more highly as leaders. There wasn't a significant relationship with any of the wanted behaviors, but express inclusion, express control, and express affection all related to leadership ratings. Express control, however, also correlated with managerial level. Those people who would reach high levels in an organization tended, on average, to have higher levels, higher scores on express control. Another factors that one might expect would relate to a level organization, like intelligence, for example. People in this study also completed a traditional intelligence test. Those scores didn't. Age did. Not surprisingly, older participants were more likely to reach more senior levels. But in terms of personality and other assessments, it was just express control. The researchers also carried out what's called a confirmatory factor analysis, a way of looking at what might underlie the variation in the results they see at the service level. And they found out that a lot of the variance associated with managerial level and leadership ratings could be mushed together and accounted for by an underlying factor, a latent factor in statistical jargon. And again, that underlying leadership capability was predicted by express control. So this study concluded that there was something especially useful about express control as a predictor of leadership capability, over and above other dimensions of Firo, and over and above other measures. Over and above, for example, what they got from Big Five questionnaires or other standard personality questionnaires. We also commented that express control was the most unique of the three dimensions and did add something extra that wasn't accounted for by other measures. And in terms of those express control results, we can back those up because as the publisher of FIRO-B, we have the advantage of having a large data archive of people who have completed the question online in the past and who have said yes to allowing us to use their results anonymously in future research. And in putting this presentation together, I looked at a large international data set of well over 100,000 people who completed the FIRO-B to see if there anything whatever might be correlated and compared with the study we just looked at. And indeed, mirroring what we found in other study, people at higher levels in organizations had on average a high level of express control than those at lower levels. Express control tends to predict how high up the ladder you're going to get. But of course, leadership isn't only about express control. It's not only about organizational level. So for example, we've been doing some work lately on what we call inclusive leadership, which we've defined as the demonstrable commitment to create workplaces with an emphasis on empowering the diverse thoughts, the perspectives, and the contributions of everybody. And in a recent survey, we asked people who took part if they were managers or leaders, and amongst those who said yes to that question, we asked them to complete 11 additional questions relating to their own leadership style, how inclusive they were as leaders. And you can see the 11 questions on the screen now. And by adding together the results on those 11 questions, we produced an overall leadership score, an inclusive leadership score for each manager, and converted that to a 1 to 10 scale. And when we compare that with the FIRO-B results, this is what we found. Leaders with high wanted inclusion score significantly higher on inclusive leadership than those with medium or low wanted inclusion, and leaders with high wanted affection scored significantly higher than those with medium wanted affection. And of those for you who like statistics, these showed medium to large effect sizes. So, for all things being equal, managers who are high on wanted inclusion and high wanted affection may tend to be seen as more inclusive as leaders, or be seen as more inclusive by their reports. A managers with a medium score, interestingly, seen as the least effective. And it may be that those managers with those medium scores, their behavior is less predictable, but perhaps less easily understood by their reports, as their interpersonal behavior might depend on the situation or on who they're working with. Final piece of research I want to look at is a piece on virtual teams, which was carried out by my colleague Helen Rayner, who's now Helen Walters, back in 2019. And what Helen did was to survey 469 people. Some of these worked in virtual teams, some worked in co-located teams where everyone was in the same office or locations, and some worked in combined teams where some people were co-located and others were remote, others were virtual. And she carried out this research back in 2019 before COVID, before lockdowns, and before people had been forced to work virtually where they wanted to or not. And participants completed a range of questions about how they felt about working in their team. And Helen again used this statistical process called factor analysis to identify underlying factors or scales in their answers. And she found 5 team scales in the way the teams worked: clarity, emotional intelligence, effectiveness, stretch, and culture. Clarity was about knowing and understanding the vision, the plans, and the goals of the organization and the team. Emotional intelligence in this context was about openness, about intimacy, about emotional awareness, and about giving and receiving social, unemotional, and personal support. Effectiveness was about completing work on time and within budget. Stretch is about having job roles that stretched people and giving people opportunities for development. And culture relates to having cultural awareness, respect, and appreciation. And when Helen compared managers with non-managers, managers scored significantly higher on clarity, emotional intelligence, stretch, and culture. And virtual managers scored higher on effectiveness compared with non-managers and other types of manager. It may be that the remote nature of a virtual manager's role sometimes allows them to be more task-focused, perhaps. So these then are the 5 team scales. Now, one of these team scales, but only one, related to the Firo dimensions. People in teams where one of these scales was high had a number of higher Firo scores. But my question to you is, which team scale do you think related most to the Firo dimensions? So Caitlin, if you'd like to launch that final poll, please. So which team scale do you think related most to the Firo? Clarity, emotional intelligence, effectiveness, stretch, or culture? Again, we'll wait till a few of you responded. I can see one area is in the lead at the moment, so please do say what you think. Again, we'll wait till around 3/4 of you have had a chance to vote. Okay, just a few more people. Okay, it's nearly 3/4 of you. So, Caitlin, let's draw that poll to a whole, please, and share those results. So we can see that 63% of you have said emotional intelligence, 30% culture, 30% effectiveness, and 11% clarity. No one feels that stretch is what related to the Firo. Okay, if you could take those results away now, please, Caitlin. Let's see what the data actually said. So emotional intelligence was your top choice, and that indeed was the scale that related most to the Firo. Expressed inclusion, expressed affection, and wanted affection all related to emotional intelligence. People with higher scores on these scales were more likely to be in a team that was held to have a high level of emotional intelligence. Now, I've just talked quite briefly about that research in terms of how it related to the Firo and to leaders. There's actually a lot of other things in there as well, and I think we're going to send you a copy of this report to look at your leisure after this webinar. It mentions those 5 team scales, looks more widely at what might make more effective teams, how that relates to things like communication and team building, and also some of the challenges that teams typically face. As well as bringing in a Firo and also the Myers-Briggs type indicator as well, and uses those to build on some conclusions and recommendations. So that should be heading your way in a little while, I think. So what we've done then is talk, as we've already said, about why interpersonal behavior is important for leaders, how the Firo looks at that area of interpersonal behavior, and there's some Firo profiles and a Firo business report, and then looked at those pieces of research. We've seen that expressed behaviors, especially expressed control, are related to the extent to which people are seen as leaders, and expressed control in particular is very relevant for looking at how high up the ladder people get at organizational level. We've seen that wanted inclusion, wanted affection are important in more inclusive leadership, so it's not just about expressed control. And we've seen that expressed inclusion, expressed affection, and wanted affection does relate to emotional intelligence in teams. And clearly, the leader, the team leader, has a particular role to play in our team in promoting those behaviors. So that's about it in terms of the general content of what we're going to talk about today. And let's finish off by looking at some of the steps that you might want to take following this webinar and some of the resources you might draw on. So Caitlin, over to you.
Thank you. That was a lot of really helpful information. And like I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out the slides and the recording. I know a couple of people have requested it already, so just wanted to mention that. And we have tons of information about the Firo tool and our certification programs on our website. We also have some resources like the Why Get Firo Certified resource mentioned here, which we will send out later this week. So now we will go ahead and get into answering some of your questions that have been sent in. And if you have any questions that you would like us to answer, go ahead and put those in the questions box now. So our first question for you, John, is, can I use the Firo for recruitment?
I'm going to give a politician's answer to that one, yes, but. So let me say a bit more about that. So we've seen, I think, that the Firo and express control in particular does relate to some aspects of leadership capability in particular. So the Firo can predict, to at least some extent, leadership success. But I think the Firo should never be used on its own as part of a selection process. I think the Firo should never be used without giving feedback and really working out how those results work for people, and clearly should only be used by people who are qualified to use the tool. And there are other things out there which perhaps are less robust in the Firo, which also look at personal needs, and I think you need to be a little bit careful about that. So as a qualified, yes, I think the Firo can be very useful as part of a structured selection, a structured recruitment program, but don't use it by itself, and do make sure that giving people Firo feedback to see how those scores really work for them is included as part of that leadership, of that recruitment process. Thanks, Caitlin. Interesting question.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is the Firo complementary to the Mbti?
Yes. So they look at two different things, but there is an overlap. And you can find some information on our website, and perhaps we can send that particular person who's asked that question, Caitlin, the link to where to find it. There's some information you find there about the correlations between the Firo and the Mbti. And it's probably no surprise to find that there's a lot of relationships, especially with inclusion and affection, to extroversion, introversion, with affection and to some extent inclusion, to thinking and feeling, and to control, we're thinking and feeling. So you are seeing some of those aspects playing out. But we're not measuring exactly the same thing. And I think they can be used very effectively together. And I believe there may be even a report which actually combines results of the Firo and the Mbti. I could be saying that wrong, Caitlin, so please do slap me down and correct me if I'm wrong. But certainly there's information on the website, and we can information provide about what the different combinations of Firo results and Mbti results might say about an individual. And I think they can be very complementary to each other because we are looking at different but complementary things. Your underlying personality type and your interpersonal needs. And one thing about your interpersonal needs is I think they can vary for your life and depending on what's going on in life rather more than the Mbti. So yeah, absolutely complementary to each other. Thanks, Caitlin.
Great. And you were right. We do have a couple of things actually that go into the two together. Some reports as well as we have some facilitation guides. So those are also on our website. So our next question is actually for me. When is the next webinar? So I'll go ahead and answer that. We do webinars frequently, so just make sure you're subscribed to our communications. If you're not sure about that, you can send us an email. We'll make sure for you. And we always send out invites for all of our webinars. So we don't have one specifically focused on the Firo scheduled at the moment, but as they come up, we will be posting them and inviting people to them. So just keep your eyes peeled for that. Okay. So the next question we have, how can I get the Firo leadership report?
Essentially, if you're Firo qualified, which relates back to what Caitlin was talking about just before, you can access the Firo leadership report. So you need to be qualified to use the Firo. There's a training program. Once you're qualified to use the Firo, you'll be able to use any reports. And that training will talk about interpreting the Firo results and also talk about the applications of the Firo in particular context, including using it in leadership. So once you have a qualification, you can use any of the Firo B or the Firo business reports. And I myself work in the UK, so I'm less familiar with the US training schedule, but Caitlin and I guess we can give that questioner information on those Firo training programs.
Definitely. We can definitely do that. Great. Okay, so the next question that I have for you, John, is when using the Firo on a team, do all team members need to take the Firo and receive feedback for it to be effective?
I would say yes, because I think just like and I'm saying that from a number of different points of view. I think, first of all, certainly in development context, just like we say with the Myers-Briggs type indicator, those Firo results should be their property. They should be the person who has some control over those. They should see how it works for them, as well as being used in that team context. And I think that feedback is absolutely important, and it's really important that they take the Firo. I think also one of the things the Firo points out to people, and to people who know those or think they know as individuals, is that difference between that expressed behavior and that wanted behavior. Because what we see in people isn't always what they want, and vice versa. So I think without people filling in the questionnaire and having results themselves, it's surprisingly easy to make those assumptions about an individual's behavior, especially when their expressed behavior is different from their wanted behavior. So I think that's another reason why that's important. Now, I appreciate that in some team building events, people may be resistant to taking questionnaires, but hopefully by talking to people as individuals, you can explain how it's been used and make it clear that ultimately they have control of results and are not using it for any untoward reasons, and that you've talked about things like confidentiality and so on. So I think, yeah, it is important that people complete the Firo and have feedback. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question is this available in multiple languages?
Yes, and I can't off the top of my head reel off exactly how many languages it's available in. It's obviously available in US English and in British English. It's available in, I think, something like 9 other European languages and other languages across the world. So if there's a particular language that you're interested in, then just put that question in the chat and Caitlin can make sure we get the right information for you. I'm saying out with a slight caveat in that all the individual Firo reports aren't always available in as many languages as the questionnaire is. But one of the things I think is really important when using a Firo, or indeed any psychometric questionnaire, is it's really important that people can take the questionnaire in their preferred language. It's easier to work around the reporting and the feedback, perhaps, in a different language. There will be Firo reports available in all languages, but the questionnaire is available, but not all of the reports are available in all of the languages. That sounds like a slightly convoluted answer, but I'm sure we have a table somewhere we can send you. That'll tell you all the ins and outs.
Yeah, I think it came across clearly.
Thank you.
Okay, so another question we have: are there any male-female differences in Firo scores?
There are differences, I know off the top of my head, in affection, in both express and want affection, and in control. In the directions that you might expect, women are more likely to have higher affection scores, men are more likely to have higher control scores. And this seems to be reasonably independent of culture across the world. That in itself perhaps doesn't matter. What perhaps matters more is linking back to the leadership research we saw the other day, that people tend to get promoted if they have higher express control. Not because they have higher express control, but because organizations value the behaviors related to that higher express control. And that can lead to a male-female discrepancy and underrepresentation of women at higher levels in organizations. And that's partly why I think it's important to look at that research on inclusive leadership and not just for more general leadership research as well, when we're looking at what's important for leaders in organizations. And I suspect as organizations become more distributed, as we have more remote and virtual workers and more hybrid workers, those aspects of leadership are going to become more important. I'm not saying that's on the basis of any specific evidence, but it feels to me as that's where things are going. So yes, there are, but hopefully we can think about how we might deal with those in organizations.
Great. Okay. And another question, more generally, I think about the Firo. Do your scores stay the same, or should you expect them to change?
They are, if we look at I'll answer the question statistically first of all, because hey, I do a lot of research. In terms of things like retest reliability, the Firo has pretty good data. It doesn't change like that overnight, but your scores quite likely might change a little over your lifetime and might be affected by the situations that you're in. Ultimately, the Firo looks at your interpersonal needs. It is likely that underneath it all, you have interpersonal needs which are reasonably constant, but the behavioral expression of those, which is what the Firo looks at, will differ perhaps. So if you have an interpersonal need that's not being met at the moment, your behavior and hence your Firo scores might change because that need isn't becoming met. One of the things we tend to find in Firo feedback, which perhaps we didn't really have a chance to talk about in detail today, is that although the Firo is a very short questionnaire, the Firo only has 54 questions, for business even shorter, it can get very deep. It can really touch on things that are really deep inside us. And that can often relate to the way in which events have affected us over our lives, or even just at the moment. Again, slightly convoluted answer, things can change, but it changes because your behavior changes depending on the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, the things that are affecting us in our lives. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so I think those are all of the questions that we are going to go over today. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up. But I would like to thank everybody for joining us. And if you do have any other questions, feel free to send them to us and we will answer them. John will answer them. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.